Hello, this is Bill Meridian speaking to you from Vienna, Austria. This is the third in a series of presentations about eclipses and their paths. These presentations will be more regular now because I am traveling a bit less. This one focuses on eclipses of the current Russian crisis. Most of this material has been drawn from my predictions in Dell Horoscope magazine. The situation began with friction between Russia and the Ukraine. My analysis began with the following principle. Eclipses conjunct the Sun tend to elevate the person or entity in stature. Eclipses opposite the Sun tend to knock one down and place the person or country at a disadvantage. You've experienced the latter if you've ever been knocked down on a soccer field. 1 minute you're looking straight ahead, the next minute you see blue sky. Indeed, many years ago in the early 60s, it was 63 or 64, John Profumo was being groomed to be the Prime Minister of England when an eclipse fell on his Sun, putting him in the spotlight, promoting him to a position of prominence. 6 months later, an eclipse opposed his Sun, and he fell with the Christine Keeler affair, the scandal that brought him down. The solar eclipses of November 3rd, 2013 and April 29th, 2014 were opposite the progressed Sun of the Ukraine. Yes, this works for progressed horoscopes also. One of the things I ignored in the last presidential election was the eclipse opposite the progressed Sun of the Republican candidate, Mitt Romney. So it works for progressed horoscopes also. Here, the first eclipse was opposite the Ukraine's progressed Sun. They were threatened by Russia. The second one was conjunct their Sun. They did not back down. Now we move to the eclipse paths. The most simple form of eclipse path analysis is to simply realize that the country, the peoples that are crossed by the shadow from which the areas are visible, from which the eclipse is visible, are going to be energized. This will take current affairs, beliefs, mythologies, whatever drives the people, and it will force it to the surface and make them very active. Here we see that October 2014 eclipse connecting the USA and Russia. Now here we have the next solar eclipse. That one is March 20th, 2015. I'm currently speaking to you in January, on January 23rd, 2015, so this has not occurred yet. We can see the eclipse path shadows Russia, and again, almost reaches the east coast of the United States, close enough for this work. One of the obvious manifestations is the fact that most of Eastern Europe, a good part of Europe, is dependent upon the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, Russia, for their gas supplies. So I could get further into that, but I won't. How do you then proceed with the analysis? Well, first, these paths draw our attention to the pair. The first step is to look back 18, 19, and 54 years in history. Eclipses that are members of the same Saros cycle occur every 18 years and carry a theme forward through time. Eclipses that occur every 19 years apart are members of a metonic cycle. They also carry a theme. Let me just stop for a minute and say, in the average Saros cycle, I think there are about 72 to 74 eclipses. Multiply that times 18 years. That's a very long cycle. Metonic cycles do not carry on for that length of time. Therefore, I have found that metonic cycle effects are more startling and more obvious than metonic cycle effects, which are more muted and below the surface. There are more of them, so they're less effective. Metonic cycles, less of them, they're more noticeable. I worked for a gentleman in the Middle East who had a Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in the second house, trine the midheaven. When an eclipse hit that Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in the second house, he started with the organization that we worked for. 19 years later, eclipse fell again, he retired. It began his career, it ended his career. But here's the important point. Eclipses that are members of the same Saros cycle generate shadows that fall backwards 120 degrees westward. After 3 eclipses, the shadow returns to the same place. 3 times 120, so it's 120 west, 120 west, and 120 west. You come back to the same place. Therefore, you have to look back at what themes were occurring 54 years ago. 1960 is the equivalent to 2014. The 1960 U-2 incident occurred during the Cold War on May 1, 1960, when a U-2 spy plane was shot down over the airspace of the USSR. In 2014, 54 years later, relations between Washington and the Kremlin were again strained by another aircraft shoot-down, that of the Malaysian passenger plane over the Ukraine on July 17, 2014. 1961 is the equivalent of 2015. The U.S. broke diplomatic relations with Cuba, and the Bay of Pigs invasion failed. East Germany erected the Berlin Wall. The USSR detonated a 50-megaton hydrogen bomb in the largest man-made explosion in history on October 29th. As we can see, the Cold War was very hot in those years, and the eclipses will stir these old themes up again. We can even look back 108 and 162 years. This points to 1906 and to 1852. The former date is only 1 year after the conclusion of the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War, which Japan won. The earlier date, 1852, takes us to the approximate time of the Crimean War that broke out in 1853. In that conflict, London was seeking a way to declare war against Russia in order to demonstrate its power, and this was over control of the Straits of Bosporus, the Dardanelles, the entrance to the Black Sea. Russia attacked a Turkish fleet at anchor at Sinop on November 30th, 1853, the day of a total solar eclipse at 8 Sagittarius. Matters begun on the day of an eclipse rarely work out as planned. London convinced France, Sardinia, and Turkey to join in a war against Moscow. Russia lost that conflict. Let me also state that rare things, or the beginnings of things, frequently occur on the day of an eclipse. This was the first time a naval vessel had fired an explosive shell. Prior to that, they fired cannonballs. And they were firing against a Turkish fleet that consisted of wooden patrol boats, so needless to say, it wasn't much of a fight. So it was, again, the beginning of a naval ship firing explosive shells on that day at that battle on that eclipse. Now, let's go back to early 2014 and recall that the Russian crisis began in the Crimea, the very area in which they lost a war approximately 3 times 54 years earlier. Let's update the analysis. The 2014-15 lunar eclipses hit Putin's sun. October 2014, lunar eclipse opposes Sun, world opinion turns against him. April 4, 2015, lunar eclipse conjunct his Sun. 3 months from now, he is not going to back down. That will strengthen his will. Let's look at the rest of his chart. We covered the first 3 items looking at the eclipse at the lunar eclipses affecting his horoscope on the previous slide. Item 4. Putin was born with Saturn only 3 degrees from his Sun at 17 Libra, square Uranus at 18 Cancer, so this configuration will be hit as Uranus and Pluto move forward. The April lunar eclipse is also on Putin's progressed Sun-Mars midpoint. That is not going to cool him off. Pluto squares his Sun in January, July, and November. Uranus opposes his Saturn in 2015. The most trying time will likely be August, when the Saturn direct station will be 45 degrees to his Sun. He is likely to remain at the top because Jupiter will move back and forth over his Jupiter midheaven conjunction. Let's add to the analysis the upcoming solar eclipse, September 13, 2015 at 20 degrees Virgo. Look at the points I've marked in this chart. 16 Aries, 30 is the midheaven at Washington, 19 Aries is Uranus, 1415 Libra is Mercury. Note how the previous eclipse degrees for the lunar eclipses fall right in this axis. Aries, Libra, right around the middle of the sign. This is what Charles Jane would call an eclipse chain. That means this eclipse, through these connections, activate the prior two eclipses, and that one eclipse, as we saw, opposed Putin's sun, the other one was conjunct it. That is an eclipse chain. This tells us that the crisis is going to remain hot, probably through the end of the year. Now, let's review the eclipse principles that we've worked with. 1. The areas eclipsed get energized. For example, there was an eclipse that passed over the French-Spanish border through the Pyrenees Mountains. My first thought was, well, there are probably a bunch of villagers there. I wonder what would possibly happen in that area. It turned out that people crossed the border regularly and did not pay tariffs or taxes on goods. One country or the other started to enforce this, and this led to riots and even deaths. Back in the early, whenever the Falkland crisis occurred, I saw an eclipse down in the Falkland Islands, and I figured it's not important, nobody lives there. Argentina invaded it, and Britain took it back. So, Area 1 is the easiest. There was an eclipse on the Vietnam-China border, I think that was 79, and China invaded Vietnam. Number 2, look back 18, 19, 54, and even 108 and 162 years for themes from those times. Elliott wave enthusiasts will probably note that 54 years, 108, 162 are all very close to the Fibonacci sequence of numbers. 3. Look at the charts of countries and leaders to see which suns have been conjoined and opposed. That is the presentation for today. I'll be back shortly. As I said, I have more time to put these presentations up. At BillMeridian.com under Publications, you can buy the Predictive Power of Eclipse Paths, which contains these principles as well as a lot more. Thank you for listening.